first thing I would just like to say thank you to HSDF. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this important topic and see all these great people here today. The way I'm going to run the session, we're going to have a couple first questions for the audience, then we're going to have some questions for the panelists. Rather than me reading their bios, which you have, I will ask them to each briefly introduce themselves in their first question, but otherwise we'll go more towards actually talking rather than bios. I want to start out by giving an opportunity to Diane and Neal and tell us a little bit about the passenger screening activities, enhancements that are underway at CBP and TSA, and in particular the things that you are seeing that go right to improving the quality of the mission. And what excites you about that, and where do you think it's going? And Diane, if I could start with you.
No, thank you so much, Patty. And Diane Sabatino, I've been with the federal government, starting with the Legacy Immigration Service back in 1998, so almost 25 years. The last two have been in my current position as the Deputy Executive Assistant Commissioner with Field Operations, working feels like the majority of my time on this very topic. Certainly what is exciting and what has been exciting about the last 2 years has been kind of the evolution, certainly. A lot of work before I came into my role by my predecessor, John Wagner, in building out a vision for the use of biometrics in, to answer the congressional mandate dating all the way back to 2002 for the biometric confirmation of all those arriving and departing from the U.S. But certainly over the last 2 years, we saw the accelerated deployment of simplified arrival for those international arriving passengers because of what we saw with respect to the pandemic, the need for that streamlined, touchless environment. Still working diligently at the rollout for biometric exit. We're at about 32 airport locations with some significant milestones to accomplish before the end of 2025. To complete that transition in public-private partnership that we have with the airlines and the airport authorities. So we are making significant progress. Our first milestone this past October, we exceeded it, and we're looking to exceed our milestone by the end of this fiscal year. But I think what's also been really phenomenal the last 2 years, and again, starting before I got there with Wagner's vision, is the partnership with TSA. And the Traveler Verification Service, that's the cloud-based biometric matching service that was built by the Office of Information Technology in CBP. And what we've been able to do is offer identity as a service to our airline and airport stakeholders, and most importantly, I think, to the Transportation Security Administration, so that we can have that biometric identity verification at all points of the travel continuum. So looking certainly within the U.S. with our air carrier partners, from, that curb to gate vision, and then certainly upon return with simplified arrival, but also looking to our international partners for biometric boarding from overseas, as well as tying in potentially baggage x-rays with that. And very similar to what the Executive Assistant Commissioner mentioned earlier, that integrated data package for the cargo environment, but kind of fashioning it the same way potentially in the air environment for passengers, leveraging all of the data that we have. Again, streamlining the inspection process and really giving our officers, our agriculture specialists, the opportunity, taking away that administrative burden from them and doing, and having them invest in what they do best, which is to speak to people. And I'm sure, turn it over to Neal. I think he's got quite a bit and a great partnership with TSA.
Sure. Thanks, Diane. So Neal Latta, Assistant Administrator for Enrollment Services and Vetting Programs out of TSA. Our office was a new office. It was stood up in a reorganization back in 2018, really with the focus to enhance the enrollment, the vetting, and the credentialing process. So we manage many populations. One of the big ones, of course, is TSA PreCheck that we manage, and we're responsible for also other programs such as Transportation Workers Identification Credentials, TWIC, hazardous materials endorsement. So when you think of TSA, sometimes a lot of people just focus on the airport, but there's also other sides to that too that we work with. As Diane said, we have a great partnership with CBP that we work with them on to enhance the customer experience. When I hear the screening at speed, I'll change it a little bit and just kind of say, for us, we really look at to make sure that it's a consistent or expected screening process. When you go to the airport and you want to get checked in, you're nervous. I mean, I think we all, as travelers, even getting back into the traveling side of things, you get a little bit nervous because you don't know what to expect. And we want to make that a consistent travel experience that happens throughout the process. So, as I said, TSA PreCheck is one of those 92, right now, 92% of the time, TSA PreCheck individuals wait 5 minutes or less. And we look to make that even higher. It's been at 95. We are finding about 30% of the traveling public is using on a daily basis is using TSA PreCheck. We also would like to see that go higher. The measure that we had was 22%, but at 30%, it allows us to take the focus, and I think I've heard risk-based screening and layered screening approach that I've heard throughout the audience and through the panels. That allows us to focus on the other populations that we know less about. As Diane mentioned, one of our big programs that we've also started to do is implement biometrics. Along with CBP's help on that, we're doing some things in Detroit and Atlanta. In Atlanta, you can drop your bag off and do a bag drop with your facial identification. Drop it off. You can go to the checkpoint. You can use your face to check in at the checkpoint, and then at the gate, you can also do the same thing to check in on your flight. So we've been able to do that with the partnership from CBP as we use their TVS system too. So I look forward to more questions and more opportunities to give you updates.
Very good. And we'll keep going back and forth as we go. Next question, though, I will move to. I think everybody here in the audience recognizes that when you're making major changes like this, I mean, some of these conversations, you know, Diane, you made the point of we've been talking about biometric entry and exit for
A long time.
a few years. I may have worked on that project at one point in my career. Part of the reasons these can be quite difficult are things around not only the buying the technology, and not only as Tadawan just noted, consistent funding for buying the technology, but frankly what the architecture is, the information sharing posture, the rule set, and frankly the very large public interest in all of this and how it's done and the way to best do it. I would like to start with Jonathan, your thought on what is the most significant challenge and what have you seen in terms of good ways to meet it?
Sure, that's a really great question. I'll introduce myself first. I'm supposed to do. So my name is Jonathan Alboum. I'm the Federal Chief Technology Officer for ServiceNow. Before joining ServiceNow, I worked in the federal government for a number of years. I was a Chief Information Officer at different agencies and organizations at the Department of Agriculture and also GSA. And eventually I became the CIO for USDA. And so I come at this as a practitioner, but also I have an industry lens and work on a lot of different projects in different agencies right now. And I think any time that we're implementing technologies, there's a high risk of failure, not necessarily because the technologies don't work, but we don't always plan our projects well, or we don't have the right governance or mechanisms around running a project so we get the value that's perceived out of it. And that can happen for a lot of reasons. You mentioned something like with biometrics, people are going to worry about privacy. So have we done the right kind of communication and socialization around this? When we're dealing with multiple agencies, have those agencies agreed to approaches or policies where we might have conflict? I have a lot of experiences within the Department of Agriculture where we try to normalize the way we collected information in different sub-agencies. We couldn't agree on basic data definitions, right? You know, how many versions of corn are there? There's a lot of versions of corn. You can't agree on corn, you're not going to agree on biometrics. So, I mean, there are things that you have to work out, ideally before you acquire technology, before you begin these projects, because if you're trying to figure it out after you've made these acquisitions, you're going to be having a very long project life cycle. You're not going to see value. People are going to get anxious, and those things tend to scuttle projects over time. So I think that planning and the change management, the socialization of these projects, we have to really work these things out. Now, the good news is you don't necessarily need a lot of funding to do those things. You need time and patience, but we can do those things as we're working on long-term funding approaches, as we're working with Congress and other ways to get the money. And I wish that as we entered these very large, complicated projects, we were very thoughtful about how we accomplish the whole thing, not just the technology acquisition or implementation, because if done in a vacuum, those things tend to work pretty well. Right? You know, we might be implementing new technology, so maybe we'll have to overcome some challenges. But that's never as hard as the people aspect of it. So I think that we have to sort of refocus on how we try and do these big things. Start with the hard stuff first, and that's the people and the policy and the process.
I'll open it up to Diane and Neal. Would you like to add to that?
Sure, certainly. I think with respect to some of the challenges related to privacy, I think, facial biometrics often gets, or facial recognition often gets intertwined or conflated with the concept of surveillance. And really important, and certainly appreciate the industry's help in kind of messaging the distinction between the business use cases that we have, certainly for CBP and TSA, with identity verification at a time and a place when an individual would normally expect to present themselves for verification, but really important for us to ensure that, and it was, certainly the privacy and the data security wasn't an afterthought. They were baked in from the beginning, of the entry-exit program, and making sure that we are as transparent as possible. And look, we're never going to convince everyone across kind of the spectrum of privacy advocacy groups, but it is really important to hear their concerns, and we often try to engage and discuss, specifically what those concerns are, to really demystify, what our business use case is. It's really important through the privacy impact assessments that we've done with DHS or published, on the websites. How are we using the information? What do we do with the information once we collect it? How do we transfer it? How do we store it? How is it ultimately, and when is it ultimately deleted? All things that are really important to note. Again, going back to that distinction in how and why we are using it, and being as forthcoming about that as possible. Again, not a challenge that is insurmountable at all. And again, it's going to require continued engagement and outreach, and certainly partnerships with industry help us with that.
I love that point. Demystify. Don't let others fill in your narrative. That's a great point. Neal?
Yeah, I was gonna highlight for challenges, as I talked about, consistency in your travel process. So if you go to one airport, you want to have the same experience that you go to another airport. So, for example, there's over 400 federalized airports, of which there's 694 active checkpoints and 2,377 active lanes. 250 of those have TSA pre-check, and then 1,623 actually have standard processing, along with some blended. So that's a combination between the TSA pre-check and standard processing. So that's a challenge for us, is to make sure that that process and that experience is the exact same thing when you go there, and along with the training of 60,000 officers that you have to go through and put in place. The other thing I'll highlight as another challenge is the amount of IDs that we see, and where technology can support us in this. And that's, so there's 56 states and territories and jurisdictions. We estimate there are over 2,800 different variations of IDs that we can see at a checkpoint that can be presented as acceptable forms of ID for us. That's where technology helps us. Excuse me, and our credential authentication technology takes that and allows that automation to help us determine fraud, and helps us determine that technology, if that identity is accurate. And that's where, once again, where Diane had mentioned on the facial. So we were taking what was done and demystifying it of this ID that's being presented. Is that truly who that person is? The system can do that better than what an officer does, and that's what the officer does today. So we're really just automating that process of the officer in that place. But getting out ahead of it, explaining to people what that process is, and ensuring that it is not being retained. Once it's being used and done, that data is discarded at that point. It's no longer needed.
I might add one more challenge to the list, and this is something I saw quite a bit in my career, and I know you all have seen examples of this as well. When leadership changes over, there are often new priorities, new requirements, things that are on a 5-year plan get cut off at year 2 and started over. I would argue that right now, both of you are frankly in a really pretty decent position comparatively. Obviously, Acting Commissioner Miller has longevity with the agency, its priorities, where it's going, and very much is invested in building it for the long term, not just the quick sales point to make sure that they're able to demonstrate forward motion on absolutely everything. And similarly with Administrator Prikoski just being reconfirmed, you're in a really great place to get some longer term movement, which is frankly unusual quite often in these spaces. Moving to our next question, and Neal, you actually mentioned a little bit at the beginning of this. Customer experience has long been part of the discussion when you're talking about screening environments. People always ask, why can't you do more about what that experience is? My experience, both as a personal traveler as well as in government, is most people in the public, when you ask them that, they really mean the entire continuum. Yes, security checkpoints or the FIS on entry are important to that, but they really mean from the time they check in on their app at home on their couch, all the way till they get on the plane, or when the aircraft arrives, till they actually physically leave the airport. This requires a really important close coordination, both between government, the aviation industry, as well as wider industry, to figure out how all those pieces knit together and work out. Would love for each of you to maybe share 1 or 2 examples that you've really enjoyed where you've seen this just work in such a good way. Something that mattered a lot to you, or a way that you thought, that's a model I can continue to build off from here. And I will see who answers the question first.
I'm happy to start because, Patty, I think what you're talking about is this idea of total experience.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about customer experience. We talk a lot about user experience, employee experience. There's all these, terms that get thrown around. But really, in the end, what we're focused on is how do we feel at the end during this transaction or activity, and at the end of it, and that the totality of that, really drives how much we trust government at times. And I think you're 100% correct. People are not great at distinguishing who is responsible for which aspect of this journey. It's the whole thing. And I think the sooner we all are thinking about the whole thing and our role in it and collaborating, we're going to do better on this. When you think about it from the administration's perspective on customer experience, executive order, or the president's management agenda, you end up. I think there are times where you can get kind of bogged down in some of the, bureaucracy around it, and the reality is that's what sort of people, the traveling public, feel like gets in the way today. But we can get very caught up in that. So we have to be out there talking to people and understanding what the biggest, pain points and challenges are. To the extent that we're able to take steps out of that process, or take the redundancy out, or I love, Neal, how you talked about having a consistent experience, because can be very different, and that can be very frustrating, because as soon as you're used to one thing, it's changed, and I think that kind of erodes that trust as well. So if you're able to find those areas of consistency, or at least help people understand why it can't always be consistent, now and we're doing better. To the extent that we can use technology to streamline a process, that's great. The idea that you could check it on your phone and you can use biometrics to speed through the process. I think if people have an understanding of the data and the privacy and those implications, people will take those things, because the value is really there, and that drives that total experience.
Neal, would you like to go
Sure,
next?
I'll keep going from there. So I'm going to make a shameless plug, and that is our innovation task force that TSA has created. So we have a task force that looks at innovation, and the beauty. One of the things we recently changed, we're very open about how we use our fees and how we use our money. TSA PreCheck fees we can use for innovation, and this is a place where we're testing things out trying to enhance the experience. This is where we do our biometrics pilots. Those are in the pre-check lanes. So we do a lot there. But the innovation task force that we run, there's broad agency announcements every I think there's 2 a year that we look for examples of technologies that we can test out and things that we should look at. So I challenge industry to think what would be good that we can test. If you haven't been to Las Vegas, we have our innovation checkpoint there. And we test out different things, self-screening, e-gates, different technologies that we're going to start to look into. But that's the beauty, that's another benefit that we have with TSA PreCheck is the ability to do those testing and put those out and try real-world tests with that. But do challenge industry to provide us your input, your suggestions. What can we do? What can we do better? I guarantee everybody here has traveled, and you all have had different experiences, and we'd love to get your feedback on that too. But those are places that we really encourage.
Certainly when it comes to the customer experience, it is a priority of ours. However, we start with security. Certainly with the biometric mandate that we have going back to the 9/11 report and outcomes, and solutions that had to be developed. I think, there's two non-starters when it comes to, developing a program. And one, we can't sacrifice passengers' privacy or data security for their convenience. But their convenience is important. And the other thing is we cannot come up with a solution that impedes commerce or slows it down, even remotely. We have to be working those hand in hand. So in the execution of the program, and this is where the beauty of the biometric entry-exit program, again, it almost sounds like it was overnight, but I think to your point, right, we go back to 2004 with U.S. Visit rolling out, some major investments going up to then, but 10 years of testing in what the right modality was, and that's where we landed on facial. Because taking a selfie, everyone knows how to do it, and it's not intimidating. It's not scary to passengers, and can be part of a seamless process. And at the same time, making sure that anything else that we add into that process isn't going to create unnecessary redundancies in things that we already have the ability to capture. But with all of the data that we receive, advanced passenger information, again, speaking to the air and maritime environment, the land border is still an environment that we're working on in terms of advanced information, and as well as in part for some of our facial biometrics in the vehicle lanes. But making sure that working hand in hand, because if we execute properly on the security aspects of it, again, removing those administrative burdens, putting our officers and agriculture specialists in that space where they can do what they do best, we don't have to necessarily talk to 100% of the people that come through because we have the information that we do already. And we can give them the opportunity to be more discerning, use, and I think mentioned earlier by former EAC Owen, the risk assessment, that we highly train people to do this type of work, and what can we do to automate the rest of the processes. And I think as Neal mentioned earlier, especially with the facial biometric, we've automated something we were doing manually for decades. Picking up a passport, looking at the individual, and making a comparison with technology that's better at doing it than the officers themselves, which is okay. Because again, their role really is to talk and determine intent.
I just want to give actually, Diane's being too humble. CBP, I think, did two things particularly well in this space. Number one is way back in the day when they said, I've got all these people coming to me saying, I can't do biometrics on entry, it's too hard, or these things are going to be too hard. CBP said, look, I'm not going to do a regulation. I'm going to put the provisions into the CUG that basically tells all the airports, if you want to send me the information this way, here's how you do it. And by the way, if you do it this way, I'm going to save 30 seconds a passenger, which means I can completely redeploy and I can move more people through for you. Pretty much everybody took you up on it. That was number one that I thought was pretty brilliant. Number two is when we started biometric entry and exit, Airlines were not excited about exit in any way, shape, or form and wanted no participation. I believe we got sued when we put out a draft regulation. Now, all the airlines are saying, again, I just realized I can board an A380 30 minutes faster using biometric boarding than I can through the old way, right? The options when you created those type of, it does both of us better, those type of alignments, which don't happen everywhere. You're 100% correct. Sometimes you can't get there from here. But when you have those options, those are some of my favorite ones of really seeing people pull together.
I think that's a great point. In order to create that automation, you have to really understand what those processes are today. They have to be documented, and you need to be able to think about how the work and the data flows in order to get your outcome, and then be willing to change it, right? And that change part is always very hard. But I've seen different people try to change processes, or different organizations try to change processes without having concurrence on what the current process is first. And it's going too fast. You have to go slow sometimes to go fast, right? If you're able to slow down and have things documented, if they're not, now you have a great foundation to innovate and automate on. So I think the fact that we're having the conversation, we're talking about the steps. It needs to be, well understood what they are, so they can be changed in a way that makes sense, not just for one organization and one process, but fit across the entirety of the ecosystem and the different parties, as you're describing, airlines and the airport and all the agencies that work in an airport.
All right, now I'm going to open up to the audience for 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll have last round of each of the panelists for their one key takeaway. That if you remember nothing else from the panel, they want you to remember this one thing. But first, we'll open up to the audience. Sir.
Question. Both Diane and Neal referred to the test at McCarran. Can you elaborate on that? Because as I understand it, that's part of what you're describing is the touchless passenger experience. Mm-hmm. Can you explain what you're doing there? And is it proof of concept, or are we expanding to other airports as well?
So in the McCarran is actually we're testing out mostly at the checkpoint. So there's a lot of new technologies there, whether it be, like I said, self-screening, queue management, those type of things inside of there. The 2 airports we're doing a lot on biometrics is going to be Atlanta and Detroit right now. Those are the 2 big ones that we have. Atlanta being the biggest one, partnership with Delta, and of course CBP. But that's the big one where you can drop your bag off when you pull up to the curb, drop your bag off with your face, and it associates your bag with you, which is also an ICAO requirement. And then when you get to the checkpoint, when you go there, then you can show up with your face. It's checked against gallery. Yes, we check against you. Compare the 2. You're on the manifest. You can go forward. And then the next one is at the gate. Yes, you're on this plane. Move on. And as Patty said, you can load the plane much faster that way too.
Well, just a touch back to what you said, Dan. Compliments to John Wagner, because when he took that on, it wasn't very popular. But phrasing things the right way and working with industry was one of the things I think we witnessed there. And the progress was just incredible.
Yeah, just to say, I think the cost avoidance, frankly,
Yes.
with what it was when the legislation was written,
Yes.
to ultimately the solution that was developed, it's truly incredible in a seamless way that doesn't, there's investment that has to take place. We've seen that, and we're working with the industry, the airlines and the airport authorities to get over the finish line with exit. But what it could have meant to the industry, entire reconfigurations of the airport environment. So it's pretty incredible.
100%. Yes, the early days were all about when are you going to stand up something on exit that looks just like entry, and we all said
So
Didn't
I
have
have
to.
nobody's going to ever fund that.
a question.
Yes, go ahead, Luke.
Just traveling recently, and it seems like every time I travel, I'm always amazed at looking at this line of hundreds of people in the non-pre-check line, and then people just sort of blowing through pre-check. And I guess 2 questions there. One is, do we have any sense, any analysis that's been done on the percent? I think you said 30% of the 70%, if they were to apply, would most likely get through? And then has there been any experimentation on maybe, again, customer experience as to maybe other ways to encourage them to apply so that we can get more people into the Trusted Traveler program?
Sure, sure. So a couple areas there. We are doing, one of the things in the TSA Modernization Act was required us to get additional vendors. So we have 2 new vendors that will be coming on for enrollment in TSA PreCheck. So hopefully we're getting into a bigger audience. I do think we can increase the numbers. I said 30%. I think we can get to 45% and still probably manage that population. And the way I kind of look at it, going back to Diane's point about security, is we are taking 45% of the population that we know a lot about, and we can really move that population through pretty quickly and then focus our attention on the other.
So is the constraint just the ability to actually process them in a pre-check environment, or is there out of that 70%, if they all applied, 60% of them would be eligible?
The vast majority would be eligible.
Wow.
Yeah, vast majority would be eligible.
And would you want them all?
Absolutely.
And
The more we know about that's coming through the
yeah,
checkpoint,
again, I'm just
absolutely.
curious about, is there a thought that maybe the reason why that it's still at 70% is because of that customer experience, or whether it's a phobia of the government trusting with their data, or whatever it is that's not encouraging them to do it? Because certainly when you get to the airport, they should be motivated.
Right, right. Yeah, we're looking at some other things like, so now when you do an enrollment, you have to go to an enrollment location. So you have to go off-site, you have to schedule some time to do that. We're looking at it kind of, I think it's similar to the CBP model of when you get to the, in journey. So you can do it at the airport. You can at least enroll at the airport, capture your information. You may not get you're not going to get the benefit right then, but at least you'll get your application in while it's fresh in your mind. So we have done some of that too. I think we'll continue to push that, make enrollment easier.
Make that experience easier.
Yep.
So I would argue the other half of it is, especially with the changing traveler dynamics right now, you're having a lot of people who don't travel all the time. And for them saying, so I'll get there half an hour early and avoid a cost, that's probably what you're battling against, right? I know for years I had to, given what my former job was, I had to browbeat my parents into actually getting pre-check, because I was like, you have to get it. And they said, but we're retired. It doesn't matter if we just wait an extra whatever. And I made them do it anyway. So, question over here.
Yeah, maybe a little more lighthearted to end today. What happens to all the stuff that's collected? The shampoo bottles, the wine corks, the scissors, and even from CBP's perspective, even the contraband and things that are not perishable. What eventually happens to all this stuff?
I'll give you that one.
Oh, thanks. Well, there's a pretty specific statute, regulation, and policy with respect to what the items are. Certainly contraband likely destroyed, but then there's certainly the forfeiture process. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the auctions that occur for some of the larger items or things, but pretty detailed, complex processes for what happens, to items, perishables, likely destroyed, animals, other things, potentially.
We did give the cat back. We gave the cat back.
Was there a second one?
Well, there was a dog. We think it was a Chihuahua from the images, but yeah, we did give it back.
It was in the backpack.
So in addition to that, TSA actually has a very interesting piece of legislation. It's actually called the loose change provision. Because you would not believe how much money gets left at the checkpoint. And TSA is allowed to retain it and reinvest it. And so they can actually make improvements that are supposed to go to the customer experience at the checkpoint with the loose change.
I do highly recommend, if you're on Instagram, our Instagram account
Yes.
is very, very popular, and it's
impressive.
very, very fun too. If you want to follow it, you get a chance to see a lot of these different things that are identified.
And recognize what a hard job those guys have.
Yeah.
All right, with that, we're going to do last round. Your key takeaway. Jonathan, I'm going to start with you.
I think the technology is important. Technology platforms, low-code capabilities, are really important in terms of making things work less complexly and easily from a customer's perspective and an agency's perspective. But the technology is not the hard part. right? We can all acquire these things. The hard part is understanding that process, understanding the workflow, making those workflow more effectively. That takes time and it takes patience and it takes a lot of communication across many organizations. And we start these projects, I think that's where we should be focused and let the technology follow in a lot of ways.
Neal.
Innovation. I keep going back to innovation. I think we have a lot of areas where we can do some automation. We're, from a standpoint, we are looking to get our officers paid more, and we are hopefully going to do that in this next Congress, to get them paid, pay equity, pay parity, however you want to phrase it. However, you can't do this all with just officers and with manpower. You have to do this in combination with technology. So areas that can help us save that manpower. That's probably the big takeaway for me.
Diane.
Oh, thank you. And I think I mentioned, biometric exit, focused on that certainly in the next year, getting to those milestones, but we have a pretty well-defined roadmap to that. I think the next kind of evolution that we're going through is gearing all of our, operations in that passenger environment towards paperless, certainly looking to TSA and the work they're doing with digital travel credentials. And what is that going to mean to our operations moving forward? Because we're not always going to have passport books. So how do our operations need to be geared with respect to that? And I think the final piece for us and a big focus in the next year is going to be our vehicle simplified arrival process. It's the facial biometrics in vehicle. We should be putting out an RFI. It's supposed to be out already, but for camera technology that can be integrated into our existing systems and testing really the ability to capture the images, frankly. The matching we know when we get a usable photo is very high, but what we are struggling with is to get usable photos. So that RFI should be coming out hopefully in the next week or so.